Rabbi Viki Bedő. This is Parshat Shavua, Parsha Wisdom. I'm Rabbi Oliver. It's lovely to welcome you here. We have a really interesting Parsha this week. It's Parshat Mishpatim.
Indeed.
One of the questions that we're looking at is, why do we start with all of these quite strange, obscure civil law, which comes up in this week's Parsha, and how can it possibly relate to a deep or to a real Jewish journey? It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Oliver. Hi, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here. And yes, it's a good question, right? Because in last week's Parsha in Yitro, we had this like really incredible, groundbreaking, literally revelatory experience at the foot of Mount Sinai, where the Jewish people, with their leader Moshe, they really encounter God, right? Like God in a thunder and a lightning, and even maybe in a voice, right? Speaks to them and pronounces the 10 Commandments. And then the next Parsha, the next kind of point in their journey, is Mishpatim, is these, which literally, and the word Mishpatim means rules, laws. And there's a lot of different types of laws and rules in the Parsha, but the majority of them are civil laws, and it's also what we call case law. So it's if X, then Y. In fact, the very first law, the very first rule, is about what happens when an Israelite acquires a slave, another Israelite, as a slave. And then they go on, they talk about murder and theft and ox goring people and fires and all kinds of details there, right?
As you say, it's like going on like a really steamy date and like being really attracted to the person, really into the person.
Exactly.
And then they take like a stack of papers and put it in front of you and say, what I'd like to now talk about is the prenuptials and
exactly.
will you clean the car on a Thursday afternoon?
Exactly. And I think actually, Rabbi Oliver, the metaphor, right, that you're bringing here about the love, like the romantic relationship, is a very good one, because the rabbis talk about, and in general, the Jewish tradition talks about the moment at Sinai when Am Yisrael, when the Jewish people meet God. That's the spark, right? That's the beginning. That's this incredible, flame of romance. And then once they get into the relationship, once the covenant starts, that's when they kind of work out the details of what does it actually mean to be in a relationship. So I think that as much as we can learn about the Torah and about our relationship with God and what it means to be a Jew, it's also a good opportunity to learn about marriage and relationships and what does it mean to be in a relationship with other human beings. Because the truth is, and this actually is where I'm going to finally answer your question, that I think there's something really, the Torah is teaching us something important about like the high, amazing, explosive moments need to be followed by like reality. And the reason, the ultimate goal and purpose of the Israelites being freed from Egypt, right, which was, we talked about that in the Parshiot previous Yitro, but then even in Yitro, right, God says, I am God, the God who brought you out of Egypt, right? So like God actually identifies God's self through this process of freeing the Jewish people. And now here we are. And the question is, okay, but how do we build a free society? What does it actually take? What do we do? Because it's great that we're all free and we're in the wilderness and we're going to like do this incredible project. But what does it actually mean to be living the day-to-day life that is not like Egypt, right? That is just, that is free, that is correct, that is better, that is more ethical. And so I think that the purpose of this Parsha of Mishpatim is to kind of lay down the ground rules for what for them, and I think this is an important comment here, if we would be thinking about what is a just and good society today, I'm not sure that we would have the same, in fact, I'm sure we wouldn't have the same rules as they had. But for them in ancient Israel, for them, this is what it meant to build a good society. And it was important for them to begin right away. We're free. Okay, we got to work on making sure that we treat each other well, that we make sure that that people can't get away with murder, that we make sure that if you have a slave, that they can go free after a few years, right? So all these details were there to make sure that they can actually build the just society that they were liberated for.
So we have to suspend our critique of some of the laws that you might be offended by or confused by in this week's parasha. But the fundamental principle which you're teaching relates to something about the distance and the differential between the romantic, explosive, beautiful relationship, which is possible in the Jewish tradition, which is possible in the spiritual tradition, which is possible also in romantic life and lots of other aspects of our life when you go to the theater or a good music gig or any of those different things. But it's also entertaining the possibility that a part of our lived experience of life has to be the continuity and consistency and the boredom. I can relate to this in my own life, the boredom of getting the job done every single day, which isn't as sexy and sassy and wonderful as the explosive, romantic, ecstatic moments, but is probably as important. That seems to be a little bit of what you're teaching today. I have to, before we finish up, introduce you as somebody who I've known for, I think, more than 10 years now. We met in the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. You're currently a rabbi, a newly minted rabbi from the Jewish Theological Seminary, working in Fairfax, Virginia, in Olam Tikva. And it's been wonderful to connect today and reconnect today in teaching together. Tell us a little bit more about this vision of building a just society, and also perhaps crucially, like, what does this mean for you today as a parent, as a rabbi, as somebody who's embarking on this rabbinic journey?
Thank you. Good. Thank you so much. Yeah, so as I said before, I mean, I love the way that you summarized it, that you know, we need the explosive, we need the big stuff, but we also need the day-to-day reality that is the Mishpatim, that are the rules. I think that for me, one of the important learnings specifically, like, for example, I mentioned this first law, right? So the very first law is that when you acquire a Hebrew slave, you have to let them let them go after 6 years. And here, right, the piece of slavery and servitude is actually quite complex and even, I think, problematic for a lot of us. And one might be asking, okay, why do we even have slavery? We were just talking about how slavery is bad in Egypt, and now this first law, one of the first laws, is how we ourselves, Israelites, have slaves. And so the reality is that for them, like in ancient Israel, they could not imagine their economy without indentured servitude, which meant that people basically sold themselves or their families as slaves when they were indebted. But at the same time, right, the balance that happens in this law, the rule that you might not get elsewhere, or that was not true in Egypt, is this letting go, right? That you have to be able to recognize the value of a human being, and that they cannot be slaves forever. They have to let them go. And there's actually this beautiful piece of grammar here where the word yeshalchenu in the verse where it says you shall let the person go is the same root. The verb of to let go is the same root as when Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go. Shalach et ami, right? So there's an understanding that we ourselves were let go because we got out of Egypt, and we too need to learn how to do that in our own society, right? We need to know, even if it's economically not in our favor, but we need to be able to do that. And there are a lot of laws, and this is the piece where I'm answering your question about what does it mean from, you know, as a rabbi and also as a woman. There's a lot of there's several laws in here, both about what it means to take a female slave, because female slaves were even more vulnerable than male slaves. It was very common, actually, that fathers would basically sell their daughters into marriage, but also as a slave by definition, right? So the economic value of women was given. Women were in many cases property, especially if the family did not have money. So there's laws about that. There's also there's laws about, you know, what happens if a woman gets quote unquote seduced, even though she's actually engaged to somebody else. And again, the question is about the price, right? It's not about what she wants. It's not about, is she in love? It's not about whether she wants to marry that man. The question is, what is her worth? Like, how much money are you going to pay for her? That's the question. And so these laws, like the law I just mentioned, as well as the piece about slavery, is hard. It's difficult. It's hard for me as a feminist. It's hard for me as somebody who, really wants to see this text as building an ethical society, but not all the pieces fit into the puzzle. Not all of this. I can't argue that all of this is what ethics looks like for me. And so what I do is I struggle through it, and I try and learn the text again and again and again. And sometimes I walk away saying, you know what, this is just not necessarily what I think fits into the perfect definition of a good law or an ethical law, but we need to read it in its context, in its ancient context. And the other piece I wanted to add here is that we need to read it through the prism of the rabbinic tradition and the kind of thousands of years of interpretive tradition that Judaism is basically all about. Because as much as the Parsha is great and the Torah is amazing, but the Torah is a living document, and it lives through us. It lives through the rabbis of the Talmud discussing it, and it lives through Rabbi Oliver and Rabbi Viki discussing it, right? And through anybody else who's listening to this on Instagram, right? Like, that's how the text is alive. And one of the very famous pieces of this, of the interpretive tradition in this Parsha is that we say, the Parsha says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And that is true in general in ancient societies. And then the rabbis come along and say, oh, an eye for an eye? No, an eye for a fine. Like, if I do something to you, then you'll just pay me a fine, right? We're gonna basically change the rules and reinterpret the laws in order so that it makes more sense for the world that they lived in. And that's what we do as well. So that's the project.
It's been wonderful learning with you. I guess the place where we start and the place where we end is this Torah of curiosity, and you've given us kind of a broad brushstroke of this parsha, real complexity in law, a real departure from last week's parsha, which is all about the ecstatic moments of revelation at Mount Sinai, into really some of the key aspects of civil law found in Jewish life. And that transition is perhaps made more gentle by listening to some of your take on this week's Parsha. Thank you for being with us. Wishing you and your community Shabbat Shalom. Please share this video with anybody you think might like it, and spread a little bit of Rabbi Bedő and my teaching from this week. Thanks a lot, Rabbi Bedő. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.